Traditions disrupted. The morning meditation at the Sacred Combat Academy of Vega Prime lasted exactly 6 hours, as it had for the past 12 millennia. Every student and instructor maintained perfect stillness, their bodies hovering precisely 3 centimeters above the blessed floor tiles, their minds supposedly contemplating the deeper meanings of combat while most actually fought to stay awake. This was tradition, and tradition was everything. Until Sarah Chin sneezed. The sound echoed through the grand hall of serenity like a supernova in a monastery, causing several younger students to lose their hover concentration and unceremoniously drop to the floor. Senior instructor Pelayer's head tentacles curled in horror, while Grandmaster Cthulhu's perfect posture faltered for the first time in 3 centuries. "Sorry," Sarah called out, her voice far too loud and energetic for the sacred space. "Dust allergy. Maybe we could crack a window." The suggestion that the meticulously climate-controlled environment of the academy needed ventilation was almost as shocking as the sneeze itself. The windows hadn't been opened since their installation 3,000 years ago, mainly because everyone had forgotten they could open at all. Student Chen, Grandmaster Cthulhu intoned, his 4 arms moving in the traditional gesture of patience bordering on exasperation, "Perhaps you would benefit from another reading of the Scroll of Proper Meditation Conduct." Sarah suppressed a groan. The Scroll of Proper Meditation Conduct was less a scroll and more a library, comprising 947 volumes of increasingly specific instructions about how to sit still and think about sitting still. She'd tried reading it during her first week at the academy but gave up around the chapter discussing the philosophical implications of breathing through one's left nostril during the 3rd quarter of the second moon's ascension. "With all due respect, Grandmaster," Sarah said, bouncing slightly on her toes, "another violation of at least 17 sacred protocols. I've been sitting still for 6 hours. Humans aren't really built for that. Maybe we could try moving meditation. Like Tai Chi." The assembled aliens shared one of their synchronized gasps of horror, a sound they had perfected over several centuries of practice. The very suggestion of movement during meditation was heretical enough to make the blessed floor tiles tremble in disapproval. But Sarah wasn't finished. "And speaking of movement, I've been studying those combat forms you showed me yesterday. I think I figured out how to make them more efficient." Cthulhu's third eye twitched violently. "More efficient," he managed to say, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "The sacred forms are perfect as they are. They have been unchanged for 10,000 years. "Yeah, that's kind of the problem," Sarah said, beginning to demonstrate. "See, if you take the stance of eternal patience and modify it slightly," she shifted her weight, transforming the traditionally static pose into something fluid and dynamic. "It flows perfectly into the movement of celestial grace. Watch." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah launched into a sequence that combined elements from a dozen different sacred forms that were meant to be practiced separately, with years of meditation between them. Her movements were quick, precise, and worst of all, practical. "By the 3 sacred suns," whispered Instructor Kellner, "she's actually using them for combat." The horror in his voice was palpable. The Sacred Combat Academy had spent millennia perfecting the art of making combat as theoretical as possible. The idea of using their techniques for actual fighting was considered somewhere between blasphemy and bad taste. Yet there was something undeniably compelling about Sarah's interpretation. Her movements flowed like water, maintaining the grace of the traditional forms while adding a deadly efficiency that had several younger students watching with poorly concealed interest. "This is unprecedented," Pelayer declared, her head tentacles now tied in actual knots of distress. "She's combining forms that aren't meant to be combined for at least another 7 centuries of study." Grandmaster Cthulhu watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. In the span of a few minutes, this human had taken forms that had remained unchanged for millennia and transformed them into something entirely new. Something dangerous. Something effective. "Perhaps," he said slowly, choosing his words with traditional care, "we should discuss this in the chamber of emergency contemplation." The chamber of emergency contemplation hadn't been used in over 2,000 years, mainly because it took 3 years just to complete the ceremonial unlocking sequence. But as Sarah continued her demonstration, now attracting a growing crowd of fascinated students, Cthulhu realized they didn't have 3 years. "Student Chen," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 12 millennia of tradition, "your innovations are concerning." Sarah paused mid-movement, a position that would have taken a traditional student decades to master. "Concerning? But look how much more effective they are. Watch." She launched into another sequence, this one combining elements from the 7 forms of celestial movement into a seamless combat routine. If you connect these forms instead of keeping them separate, you get a complete fighting system. The word "fighting" sent shivers through the assembled instructors. Fighting was something that happened in theory, in meditation, in philosophical discussions that could last for centuries. It wasn't supposed to be practical. As the day progressed, the situation only grew more complicated. Word of Sarah's innovation spread through the academy faster than traditionally allowed. News was supposed to travel at a dignified pace of 1 corridor per week. Students began asking questions, the most dangerous of developments in an institution built on unquestioning acceptance of tradition. "But why can't we move faster?" one brave soul asked during the afternoon contemplation session. "Why do we need to meditate for 3 years before learning each new form?" another ventured. "Could Sarah show us that spinning kick again? The one that combines the stance of eternal waiting with the movement of gradual dawn?" By sunset, the academy was in chaos, or what passed for chaos among the Zenari, which meant slightly faster walking and almost audible murmuring. The Council of Masters convened an emergency session, which began with the traditional 6 hours of silent contemplation before anyone was allowed to speak. Revolution in motion. The Sacred Combat Academy's archive hall was experiencing something unprecedented: activity. For the first time in 3 millennia, students were actually reading the ancient scrolls instead of just bowing to them from a respectful distance. The cause of this historical disruption was, unsurprisingly, Sarah Chen. "Look at this," she exclaimed, spreading out a dusty manuscript that hadn't been touched since its creation. These original forms were way more dynamic before they got slowed down. "See these notation marks? They're timing indicators." Instructor Kellner's third eye began its now chronic twitching. "Those aren't timing indicators," he protested weakly. "They're meditation pause suggestions." "Nope, definitely timing marks," Sarah insisted, pointing to the ancient symbols. "And look at these diagrams. The original masters were totally doing these moves at full speed." Someone later added all these notes about slowing everything down. She wasn't wrong, and that was the worst part. The earliest scrolls showed techniques that were surprisingly practical, even athletic. It had taken centuries of dedicated bureaucracy to transform them into the glacially paced theoretical exercises they were today. Meanwhile, in another part of the academy, Grandmaster Cthulhu was facing a different crisis. His morning meditation had been interrupted by a call from the Galactic Combat Arts Council, a governing body that hadn't actually governed anything in several thousand years. "She's posting what?" Cthulhu asked, his 4 arms moving through the gestures of extreme confusion. "Training videos," replied Council Member ZYX, his holographic form flickering with agitation. "On something called Spacegram. They're going, how do the humans say it, viral." "This cannot continue," declared Master Vorix, his ceremonial robes rustling with concern. "She's disrupting 12,000 years of tradition." "She completed the sequence of infinite patience in under an hour," Pelayer added, her voice trembling. "It's supposed to take at least 3 decades. And her innovations." Kellner's third eye was now twitching so violently it threatened to achieve orbit. "Students are beginning to think that combat forms should be useful." Grandmaster Cthulhu listened to the concerns of his fellow masters, his 4 arms moving through the traditional gestures of deep contemplation. The situation was unprecedented. In all the Academy's history, no one had ever suggested that their ancient combat arts should actually be practical. But as he watched Sarah through the chamber's ceremonial viewing crystal, demonstrating her modified forms to an increasingly enthusiastic group of students, he couldn't help but wonder, what if she was right? The thought was so shocking he had to spend the next 3 hours in meditation just to calm down. As night fell over the academy, Sarah remained in the training hall, moving through her modified forms with an enthusiasm that bordered on sacrilege. She had already mastered techniques that took traditional students centuries to learn, and worse, she was improving them. "Hey, Grandmaster Cthulhu," she called out, spotting him observing from his traditional hiding spot behind a ceremonial pillar. "I think I figured out how to combine all 18 positions of stellar grace into one continuous sequence. Want to see?" Cthulhu felt a headache building in all 3 of his cerebrals. The 18 positions of stellar grace weren't meant to be combined. Each position was supposed to be contemplated individually for at least 7 years before moving on to the next. But as Sarah demonstrated her unified sequence, he couldn't deny that it was effective. And that was the problem. The Sacred Combat Academy had built its reputation on being the most prestigious, most traditional, and most time-consuming martial arts institution in the galaxy. Now, in just a few weeks, a human was threatening to transform their carefully preserved art into something actually useful for combat. As he watched Sarah teach a group of younger students how to perform a modified version of the Dance of 8 Moons, traditionally a 3-century commitment, in under an hour, Cthulhu realized that the academy stood at a crossroads. They could either resist this change, holding fast to their traditions, or they could adapt. The very thought of adaptation made his ceremonial beard curl in distress. Adaptation meant change, and change was something the academy had successfully avoided for 12 millennia. But as Sarah's voice echoed through the hall, enthusiastically explaining how to transform the traditionally static pose of eternal contemplation into a devastating counterattack, Cthulhu had a disturbing thought. Maybe it was tea. Cthulhu had to meditate for 3 hours just to process this information. The idea of sharing sacred combat techniques publicly was bad enough, but the fact that beings across the galaxy were watching, learning, and worst of all, commenting, was unprecedented. The latest video showed Sarah demonstrating how to combine 3 traditionally separate forms into one fluid sequence. It had already garnered millions of views and comments like, "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" and, finally, "Combat forms that make sense." The Academy's carefully maintained reputation for being the most prestigious and traditional combat school in the galaxy was being undermined by social media, of all things. But the real problems were just beginning. In the main training hall, Sarah had started what she called a practical application study group. The very phrase made traditional instructors' head tentacles curl in horror. Study groups were technically allowed, but they were supposed to involve sitting in perfect stillness while contemplating the theoretical aspects of combat. Sarah's group was actually moving. "Okay, watch this," she demonstrated to an eager group of students. "The stance of ethereal contemplation. It's actually a perfect setup for a throw. See how the weight distribution works." To the horror of watching instructors, she proceeded to demonstrate by actually throwing another student. Even more horrifying, the thrown student bounced back up with enthusiasm, asking to learn the technique. "This is worse than we thought," Pelayer whispered to Cthulhu as they observed from their traditional hiding spot. "She's not just changing the forms, she's making them interesting." The word "interesting" sent shivers through the assembled masters. Combat forms weren't supposed to be interesting. They were supposed to be serious, philosophical, and preferably tedious. That was the whole point. But the infection of enthusiasm was spreading. Students who had previously spent their days in perfect stillness were now moving, practicing, and worst of all, enjoying themselves. Some had even started incorporating Sarah's modifications into their daily routines. The Academy's carefully maintained atmosphere of solemn contemplation was being disrupted by the sound of actual training. Students could be heard counting repetitions, giving each other feedback, and even laughing, a sound that hadn't echoed through these halls since the Academy's founding. In the Chamber of Emergency Contemplation, the Council of Masters gathered for another crisis meeting. This one began with only 3 hours of silent meditation instead of the traditional 6, indicating the severity of the situation. "We must do something," declared Master Vorix. "Yesterday, I caught a group of junior students practicing without first performing the traditional 3-day preparation ritual. It's spreading to other departments," added Master Krell, all 7 of her eyes wide with concern. The Theoretical Combat Mathematics Division reported students asking about practical applications. The very idea was shocking. The Theoretical Combat Mathematics Department had spent millennia developing complex equations to describe combat moves that were never meant to be actually performed. The idea of applying their calculations to real movement was disturbing. But the worst news was yet to come. The Galactic University of Combat Arts has requested a demonstration, Pelayer announced, her voice trembling. "They want Sarah to show how she's modernizing our traditional forms." The chamber erupted into chaos, or what passed for chaos among the Zenari, which meant slightly faster head tentacle movements and almost audible gasping. The Galactic University of Combat Arts was their oldest rival, an institution that had spent millennia claiming their approach to combat training was too practical and not theoretical enough. The idea that the Sacred Combat Academy was now being seen as a source of practical combat innovation was both ironic and terrifying. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully unaware of the political crisis she was causing. She was too busy discovering that the legendary sequence of infinite patience, traditionally taught over 3 centuries, could be condensed into a practical 15-minute warm-up routine. "Look at this," she exclaimed to her growing group of followers. "If you do these moves at actual combat speed, they flow together perfectly. It's like they were designed that way." She was right, of course. The original creators of these forms had been practical combat masters. It had taken thousands of years of dedicated bureaucracy to transform their effective techniques into the slow-motion theoretical exercises they were today. But now, thanks to Sarah's influence, students were beginning to rediscover the original spirit of these ancient arts. The Academy's carefully maintained tradition of taking as long as possible to achieve as little as possible was being challenged by actual progress. The situation reached a critical point when Sarah discovered the Forbidden Archives, a section of the library that contained scrolls so ancient they predated the Academy's shift towards extreme traditionalism. "These are amazing," she exclaimed, poring over documents that hadn't been read in millennia. The original masters were actually using these techniques in real combat situations. "Look at these battle accounts." The assembled instructors could only watch in horror as she began reconstructing these ancient, practical techniques. Worse still, she was documenting everything and sharing it on her increasingly popular social media channels. Day 47 at the Academy, her latest post read. "Just discovered these awesome original scrolls that show how the forms were meant to be used in actual combat. Starting a new video series, Ancient Techniques, Modern Application. Like and subscribe." The post gained 1 million followers in less than a day. In his private Day 47 at the Academy, her latest post read. "Just discovered these awesome original scrolls that show how the forms were meant to be used in actual combat. Starting a new video series, Ancient Techniques, Modern Application. Like and subscribe." The post gained 1 million followers in less than a day. In his private meditation chamber, Grandmaster Cthulhu faced a difficult reality. The Academy was changing, whether they wanted it to or not. Sarah's influence had awakened something that had been dormant for millennia, actual interest in combat. Students were asking questions, practicing with purpose, and worst of all, improving at a rate that threatened to make their traditional decade-per-technique teaching schedule obsolete. As he observed Sarah teaching a group of enthusiastic students how to transform the traditionally static pose of eternal contemplation into a dynamic combat sequence, Cthulhu had another disturbing thought: what if this wasn't just a crisis? What if it was an opportunity? The thought was so radical he had to spend 5 hours in meditation to recover from it. But the seeds of change had been planted. The Sacred Combat Academy, which had remained unchanged for 12 millennia, was facing a revolution. And at its center was a human who had the audacity to suggest that combat forms should actually be useful for combat. As the second week of Sarah's tenure at the academy drew to a close, the traditional masters faced an uncomfortable question: could 12,000 years of tradition survive a single semester of practical application? The answer, though none of them wanted to admit it, was becoming increasingly clear. The real question was, what would the academy become in the process? Galactic Spotlight. The Sacred Combat Academy's ceremonial communications array, which hadn't received more than 2 messages per century for the past millennium, was now experiencing what instructor Kellner described as a catastrophic abundance of interest. The cause, as usual, was Sarah Chen. Another interview request, Pelayer announced, her head tentacles twisted into shapes that violated several laws of geometry. This one's from Galaxy Warriors Quarterly. Apparently, they want to do a feature on how we're revolutionizing traditional combat arts. Grandmaster Cthulhu, who had spent the last 3 days in nearly continuous meditation trying to process the situation, managed to maintain his composure for almost 5 seconds before all 4 of his arms went limp with distress. Revolutionizing, he whispered, the word tasting like ceremonial sandpaper on his tongue. We haven't revolutionized anything in 12,000 years. It's one of our proudest achievements. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Sarah's training videos had sparked a galactic phenomenon. Combat schools across 3 spiral arms were suddenly questioning their own traditional practices. Some had even begun, the horror, experimenting with practical applications. The situation reached a new level of crisis when the Galactic Combat Arts Federation, an organization so ancient and traditional it made the Academy look progressive, announced its decision to broadcast the upcoming 10 Millennium Tournament live across all networks. Live? Master Vorix's ceremonial monocle actually cracked from the shock. But the tournament is supposed to take 3 years to complete. Most of that time is dedicated to pre-movement meditation. They want to compress the schedule, Pelayer reported, reading from a ceremonial datapad with trembling tentacles. They're suggesting we complete each match in less than a solar day. The assembled masters shared a synchronized gasp of horror, a sound they had perfected over several centuries but were now getting far too much practice using. Meanwhile, in the main training hall, Sarah was blissfully unaware of the political crisis she had sparked. She was too busy teaching a group of enthusiastic students how to transform the legendary sequence of celestial harmony, traditionally performed over 7 years, into a practical 5-minute combat routine. See how these movements connect, she demonstrated, flowing through forms that were meant to be separated by months of philosophical contemplation. The ancient masters designed this as one continuous sequence. We're just putting it back together. Her students, a growing group that now included several junior instructors, though they would never admit it officially, watched in fascination. The traditional forms were coming alive in ways they had never imagined possible. But the real shock came when Sarah discovered the tournament archives. Wait a minute, she said, poring over ancient recordings with growing excitement. The original tournaments were actual combat competitions. With scoring systems and everything. Those records are from the First Age, Instructor Kellner explained nervously, his third eye doing its now familiar stress twitch. Before we evolved beyond the need for such primitive practices. You mean before someone decided that watching paint dry was more exciting than your current tournament format, Sarah muttered, but not quietly enough to prevent several nearby masters from requiring emergency meditation sessions. The modern tournament of 10 millennia had evolved, or devolved, depending on who you asked, into an event where competitors demonstrated their mastery of staying perfectly still while thinking about moving. The winner was traditionally the one who could maintain the most serene expression while contemplating the theoretical possibility of combat. Sarah had other ideas. Look at these original scoring guidelines, she exclaimed, spreading out ancient scrolls that hadn't been touched since the Academy had decided that touching scrolls was too aggressive. They had actual matches, with points for effective techniques. The news spread through the Academy faster than traditionally allowed. Information was supposed to flow at the speed of continental drift, or slower if possible. Students began asking dangerous questions. Could we try the original tournament format? What if we actually scored points based on technique? Can we move faster than one motion per solar day? The situation reached its crisis point when Sarah uploaded a video reconstructing an ancient tournament match based on the historical records. The footage showed her demonstrating how the traditional forms could be used in actual combat situations, complete with scoring points and, most shockingly, visible exertion. The video went viral across the galaxy, crashed 3 major communication networks, and caused a minor religious crisis in a civilization that worshipped slow motion. In the Chamber of Emergency Contemplation, now practically serving as the Master's second home, the Council faced their greatest challenge yet. The Federation expects us to participate in the tournament using these modified forms, Pelayer announced, her voice barely a whisper. They're calling it a return to traditional values. The irony was not lost on anyone. The Academy had spent millennia perfecting the art of making combat as theoretical as possible, and now they were being praised for accidentally returning to practical applications. But the greatest shock was yet to come. There's more, Pelayer continued, her tentacles now tied in knots that would take years to untangle. They want Sarah to lead our tournament team. The chamber erupted into chaos, or what passed for chaos among the Zenari, which meant slightly faster blinking and almost audible muttering. Sarah, when informed of her new role, responded with characteristic enthusiasm. Great! When do we start training? Training? Master Vorix's ceremonial eyebrows achieved escape velocity. But we haven't finished the traditional pre-training meditation series. It takes at least 3 centuries to properly prepare for tournament training. We have 3 weeks until the tournament, Sarah pointed out. Exactly. Vorix exclaimed. Barely enough time to complete the first phase of preparation contemplation. But Sarah was already moving, transforming the Academy's traditional training methods with the same efficiency she had applied to their combat forms. Under her guidance, students began practicing actual techniques, sparring, a word that had been banned from the Academy for 7,000 years, and worst of all, sweating. The traditional masters could only watch in horror as their carefully maintained world of theoretical combat was invaded by practical application. Students were learning in days what had traditionally taken decades, and worse, they were enjoying it. Grand Master Cthulhu, observing from his traditional hiding spot, now equipped with stress relief crystals, found himself facing an uncomfortable reality. The upcoming tournament would force the Academy to publicly display either their traditional methods or Sarah's innovations. The choice was clear, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. As news of the Academy's revolutionary approach spread across the galaxy, other combat schools began sending observers. Most came expecting to be horrified by the changes, only to find themselves reluctantly intrigued by the effectiveness of Sarah's methods. But when do they meditate? Asked one visiting master from the Monastery of Eternal Contemplation. Between rounds, Sarah replied cheerfully, demonstrating a combination that linked 3 traditionally separate forms into one devastating sequence. We found that short, focused meditation actually works better than spending 3 years thinking about moving. The visitor had to be carried out on a stretcher, overwhelmed by the heresy, but not before asking for a copy of Sarah's training schedule. As the tournament approached, the Academy found itself at the center of a galactic cultural revolution. Their reputation as the most traditional combat school in the galaxy was being replaced by a new, more dynamic image. Some traditionalists were horrified, of course. The Academy had received strongly worded letters from no less than 7 different councils of combat philosophy, each taking at least 6 months to compose using traditionally approved writing methods. But others, particularly younger practitioners across the galaxy, were energized by the changes. Combat arts that had been frozen in amber for millennia were coming alive again. And at the center of it all was Sarah Chen, still blissfully unaware of the galactic political crisis she had sparked, too busy teaching a group of enthusiastic students how to transform the pose of eternal waiting into something that actually worked in a fight. As the final weeks before the tournament ticked away, the Academy faced its greatest challenge yet, proving that 12,000 years of tradition could adapt to change without completely falling apart. The galaxy waited with bated breath, or what passed for bated breath among species that had evolved beyond the need for regular respiration. The tournament of 10 millennia was about to become very interesting indeed. EOT. The Tournament of Change. The Grand Tournament Arena of Vega Prime, traditionally used once every 1,000 years for extremely slow-moving exhibitions of theoretical combat mastery, was experiencing something it had never been designed for: excitement. The stands were packed with beings from across the galaxy, many equipped with meditation cushions that would never be used. "Is this entertainment?" whispered Master Vorix, watching in horror as spectators actually showed visible interest in the proceedings. "We haven't entertained anyone in 12,000 years. It's against at least 17 sacred protocols." But there was no time to consult the Manual of Proper Tournament Conduct, traditionally reviewed for a minimum of 3 centuries before any competition. The Tournament of 10 millennia was about to begin, and for the first time in its history, it would be completed in less than a decade. Sarah Chen stood with her team in the preparation area, surrounded by students who had transformed from traditional statues in training into actual combat practitioners. Even now, she was making last-minute adjustments to their techniques. "Remember," she instructed, "the sequence of eternal patience works great as an opening stance, but don't get stuck in it. That's what they'll expect. Instead, transition immediately into." "Student Chen." Grandmaster Cathul interrupted, all 4 arms moving in the traditional gesture of extreme concern. "The traditional pre-tournament meditation period is only half complete. We still have 7 more days of contemplating the philosophical implications of standing up. The first match starts in 10 minutes, Sarah pointed out. "Exactly. Barely enough time to achieve the first level of preliminary pre-movement contemplation." But Sarah's attention was already elsewhere. Through the preparation area's ceremonial viewing crystal, she could see their first opponents, the team from the Monastery of Perpetual Theory, a school so traditional they considered the Sacred Combat Academy dangerously progressive for allowing students to blink without first meditating on the metaphysical implications. "Oh boy," Sarah muttered, watching the opposing team demonstrate their mastery of perfectly synchronized non-movement. "This is going to be interesting." The tournament's new format, a compromise between traditional methods and practical application, had caused nearly as much controversy as Sarah's training videos. Matches would be judged on both technical mastery and practical effectiveness, a combination that had caused several traditional judges to require emergency meditation sessions. The first match began traditionally enough, with both teams demonstrating their mastery of classical forms. The monastery team moved with perfect, glacial precision, each gesture taking exactly the traditionally mandated 3 hours to complete. Then it was the Academy's turn. "Ready?" Sarah whispered to her team. They nodded, a gesture that caused several traditional judges to mark down their scores for excessive speed of head movement. What followed was unlike anything the tournament had seen in its 10,000-year history. The Academy team began with the traditional sequence of celestial harmony, but then, to the shock of everyone except their increasingly large fan base, they began to speed up. The ancient forms flowed together in a display that was both technically perfect and practically effective. Movements that were traditionally separated by years of meditation were linked into seamless combinations. The audience, forgetting centuries of training in proper non-reaction, actually gasped. They're doing it correctly," shouted one spectator, before being shushed by 17 different etiquette enforcement drones. The judges, faced with something entirely outside their experience, didn't know how to react. The Academy team was executing the traditional forms perfectly, but at speeds that made them actually useful. It was technically flawless yet practically effective, a combination that had been considered mythologically impossible. "This is unprecedented," declared head judge ZYX, his ceremonial scoring abacus trembling in his tentacles. "They're achieving enlightenment through actual movement." The monastery team, watching their opponents transform 12,000 years of theoretical combat into something practically applicable, did the only thing their training had prepared them for. They began their traditional 3-day meditation on proper response protocols. By the time they emerged from their meditation, they had been eliminated from the tournament. As the competition progressed, the academy team continued to shock and amaze. Sarah's innovations, combined with the perfect technical foundation of traditional training, proved unbeatable. Teams that stuck to purely traditional methods found themselves eliminated by opponents who could actually move. Schools that attempted to copy Sarah's techniques without understanding the underlying principles fared no better. But the real revolution came during the semifinals. The academy faced the team from the Institute of Theoretical Combat Mathematics, a school that had spent millennia calculating the perfect angles for techniques they never actually performed. Their team captain, Master Algorith, approached Sarah before the match. "We have computed," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of calculations, "that your modifications to the traditional forms have improved their efficiency by exactly 2,147.3%. "Oh." Sarah replied, intrigued. "How did you figure that out?" "We spent the last 3 weeks running the numbers instead of meditating," Algorith admitted, looking slightly guilty. "It was exhilarating." What followed was the most unusual match in tournament history. The Institute team, combining their theoretical perfect calculations with Sarah's practical applications, put up an incredible fight. Their movements, guided by thousands of years of mathematical analysis, were precise and effective. The Academy team won, but barely, and Sarah spent hours after the match discussing the mathematical principles behind different combat techniques with the Institute team. Several traditional masters had to be revived with smelling salts when they overheard her suggesting that mathematics could be practically useful. But the greatest challenge awaited in the finals: the Celestial Combat College, the only other school that had begun experimenting with practical applications. Their team had been studying Sarah's videos since they first went viral, and they developed their own innovations. The night before the final match, Sarah found Grandmaster Cthulhu in the meditation garden, all 4 of his arms moving through traditional stress relief patterns. "Nervous about tomorrow?" she asked. "Nervous?" Cthulhu's third eye blinked rapidly. "That would be an emotion. We have spent 12,000 years learning to transcend emotions." "Right," Sarah grinned. "So, very nervous then?" Cthulhu was quiet for a moment, his ceremonial beard twitching slightly. "In all my centuries of teaching," he finally said, "I have never seen the forms executed with such effectiveness. It is both disturbing and..." He paused, struggling with a concept that had been forbidden for millennia: impressive. Coming from a traditional master, this was equivalent to jumping up and down with excitement while shooting fireworks. The final match drew the largest audience in the tournament's history. Beings from across the galaxy watched as 2 teams prepared to demonstrate how traditional combat arts could be both technically perfect and practically effective. What followed was a display that would be talked about for centuries. Both teams moved with incredible speed and precision, their techniques a perfect blend of ancient wisdom and modern innovation. Traditional forms flowed into practical applications, each movement both technically flawless and martially effective. The Academy team's victory, when it came, was by the narrowest of margins. The deciding factor, ironically, was their superior meditation between rounds, a traditional skill that proved crucial for maintaining focus during high-speed combat. As the final scores were announced, Sarah turned to her team with a grin. "See? I told you all that meditation training would come in handy." The traditional masters, watching from their ceremonial observation pods, found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth: the old and the new could coexist, even strengthen each other. It was possible to honor tradition while embracing progress. The galaxy's media exploded with coverage of the tournament. Combat schools across 3 spiral arms began announcing modernization initiatives. The Sacred Combat Academy, after 12,000 years of perfect traditionalism, had become the leader of a revolution. But the greatest change was yet to come. As the tournament concluded, the Galactic Combat Arts Federation made an unprecedented announcement. They were establishing a new division dedicated to practical application of traditional forms. Even more shockingly, they wanted Sarah to help develop the curriculum. The traditional masters could only watch as their carefully maintained world continued to transform. But as they observed Sarah teaching a post-tournament seminar on practical applications of theoretical principles, something unexpected happened. They began to see the beauty in change.